This episode explores colonial myths surrounding cannibalism and their use to justify exploitation and violence against indigenous peoples. While we aim to address these topics respectfully and accurately, some discussions may be sensitive for certain listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The ship had been dead in the water for days. Survivors huddled together, salt-crusted and delirious, their water gone, their hopes fading with each passing hour. Jonathan Dickinson watched as his wife Mary clutched their infant son, her eyes scanning the endless Florida coastline, a landscape that seemed more threat than promise. When the A's warriors appeared, it wasn't like the stories back home. No screaming, no immediate violence, just silent figures emerging from the mangroves, bodies painted, movements deliberate as hunting cats. We were exceedingly apprehensive of the Indians, Dickinson would later write, these cannibals who might devour the flesh of men. But survival would reveal a far more complex truth. Welcome to Mysteries of the Marsh, where we dig into the Sunshine State's strangest legends, untamed histories, and forgotten stories. I'm Samantha, an 8th-generation Floridian with a passion for unearthing the tales that colonialism tried to bury. Behind one of Florida's most misunderstood and unsettling narratives lies a story of fear, power, and colonial imagination. The myth of indigenous cannibals reveals far more about the fears and motives of the colonizers than the people they sought to erase. A dark chapter tangled in propaganda and Florida's wild, untamed frontier. So grab your bug spray and settle in. We're about to peel back the layers of history to uncover the truth behind this deeply complex legend. By the time Europeans reached Florida, the myth of cannibalism in the Americas was already well established. Tales of savage man-eaters were not born in the New World. They were imported by European imaginations, shaped by centuries of folklore. Medieval Europe was steeped in stories of the monstrous and unknown. Travelers' accounts described cynocephali, dog-headed men and flesh-eating giants who lurked in distant, uncharted lands. These figures, a mix of fear and fascination, became stand-ins for the dangers of the other, reinforcing the idea that civilizations beyond Europe were inherently wild. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, these ancient myths collided with a new reality. He had heard tales from the Arawak about a people they called the Caribs, described as fierce warriors and possible man-eaters. Columbus, eager to frame his discoveries in terms familiar to European audiences, mistakenly linked the word Carib to canis, the Latin word for dog, and conjured images of the dog-headed cannibals from medieval lore. The word cannibal was born, and with it an enduring narrative. This wasn't just a linguistic accident. Columbus's descriptions of the Caribs as violent, man-eating savages were strategic. Back in Spain, labeling indigenous peoples as cannibals justified conquest, enslavement, and conversion. Queen Isabella made a decree in 1503 that forbade the enslavement of natives unless they were cannibals. This created an incentive for explorers to spread these stories. The myth-making machine exploded. Publishers in Europe churned out dramatic accounts of feasts, complete with lurid illustrations that depicted roasting human limbs and boiling cauldrons. These images, often drawn by artists who had never set foot in the Americas, exaggerated the idea of cannibalism to fit European fears and expectations. Even accounts of ceremonial practices like human sacrifice were twisted into evidence of widespread savagery, ignoring their cultural and spiritual significance. These distortions reflect more about European fears than they did about the realities of indigenous life. Florida itself added to these fears, a land of overwhelming contrasts and untamed beauty. Dense forests of towering cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, bordered swamps alive with the splash of alligators and the calls of unseen creatures. Rivers wound through the wilderness, their banks lined with impenetrable mangroves. The air, thick with humidity, buzzed with the life of insects. Along the coastline, barrier islands shifted constantly with the tides, a reminder of the land's volatile nature. To European eyes, accustomed to cultivated fields and orderly towns, the chaotic vitality of Florida's landscape felt as alien as its inhabitants. And the land's abundance came with an undercurrent of danger. It was a place where fish and game were plentiful, but so were venomous snakes and hidden quicksand. Early settlers, unfamiliar with the rhythms of the land, found themselves at its mercy. For many, Florida seemed less a place to settle and more a landscape to survive, its beauty veiling a constant threat. To the Europeans, the A's and other indigenous peoples seemed inseparable from this wild and unfamiliar environment. Their homes, designed to withstand Florida's climate with raised floors and open walls, reflected a deep understanding of the local environment that contrasted with typical European dwellings of the time. Their customs and languages, so different from European norms, became further evidence of their supposed otherness. In this environment, fear and misunderstanding thrived. Primed by centuries of monstrous myths, settlers arriving in Florida didn't just see a new land, they projected their darkest fears onto it. The A's, with their intricate societies and deep knowledge of the land, were reduced to caricatures, savage man-eaters lurking in the swamps. Stories of cannibalism fit neatly into the narrative colonizers needed to justify their actions, transforming nuanced societies into the villains of a larger colonial story. The Spanish weaponized these narratives to justify the conquest and enslavement of indigenous peoples. The legal basis for this was outlined in the Requerimiento of 1513, which demanded that natives submit to Spanish rule and convert to Christianity. Failure to comply was equated with cannibalism and savagery, providing a pretext for enslavement and violence. The Indians must be made to understand the Christian faith, by whatever means necessary, declared the Requerimiento. This doctrine enabled Europeans to label indigenous peoples as cannibals or non-Christians, providing a legal framework for their subjugation. The Calusa, a powerful maritime society in southern Florida, were among the first in the region to face these accusations. Spanish explorers described the Calusa as giants and claimed they practiced ritual cannibalism. Yet no archaeological evidence supports these claims. The stories likely stemmed from the Calusa's fierce resistance to Spanish influence. They were not easily conquered, and their strategic dominance over Florida's waterways made them a threat to European ambitions. In contrast, the A's may have leaned into the myth. With a century and a half of European incursions under their belt, they understood that fear could be a powerful weapon. Rumors of their supposed savagery kept intruders at bay, acting as a psychological barrier against further colonization. This wasn't just survival, it was strategy. But while the A's might have used the myth to their advantage, the broader narrative was out of their control. French, Spanish, and English accounts all recycled the same tropes, painting indigenous peoples as inherently violent and primitive. These stories fed into a broader colonial worldview that placed Europeans at the pinnacle of civilization, erasing the complexity and sophistication of societies they sought to conquer. But the hypocrisy of this narrative is hard to ignore. While Europeans condemned indigenous peoples for imagined cannibalisms, they practiced their own form of it back home. Medicinal cannibalism, was widespread in 16th and 17th century Europe. Human bones were ground into powder and consumed as cures for headaches. Blood was prescribed for epilepsy. Fat from human cadavers was applied to wounds. The very societies that condemned supposed savages in the Americas were consuming human remains under the guise of medicine. This double standard underscores the real purpose of the cannibalism myth. It was about justifying their exploitation. In Florida, these myths became one of the most enduring weapons of colonial domination, shaping the way Europeans perceived and interacted with the A's and other indigenous groups. It was into this fraught landscape that Jonathan Dickinson found himself shipwrecked in 1696. Dickinson wasn't just another sailor. He was a wealthy Quaker merchant from Jamaica, educated and resourceful enough to keep a detailed journal of his harrowing experience. When his ship, the Reformation, wrecked off Jupiter Island, he was traveling with his wife Mary, their infant son, and 10 others, including enslaved individuals. Stranded in unfamiliar territory, Dickinson and his party faced immediate danger, not just from the elements, but from their own fear. The Indians came to us, staring upon us, having no weapons in their hands but clubs, he wrote of their first encounter with the A's. We were much afraid that they would kill and eat us. His words echoed centuries of European myths about the New World, myths that cast indigenous peoples as dangerous savages. Yet, even in the early pages of his journal, a more nuanced story begins to emerge. Dickinson noted the A's methodical movements, their painted bodies blending into the mangroves, and their initial silence. These weren't the erratic, bloodthirsty figures he had been taught to expect. Instead, their actions seemed deliberate and calculated, intimidating, yes, but not immediately violent. Dickinson's fears slowly gave way to glimpses of the A's daily life. He observed their canoes gliding across the water, their homes constructed from local materials, and the evidence of intricate social systems. While his observations were limited, they hinted a society far more complex than European prejudices allowed. As Dickinson's journey unfolded, the A's defied his expectations in profound ways. They gave his infant son shelter when he fell ill, they shared their food despite their own limited resources, and they guided his party towards safety, protecting them from more aggressive inland tribes. Dickinson wrote of these moments of kindness. They came to us in a kindly manner, offering us what little they had. And later, when his son fell ill, the women and children seemed kind unto us, bringing us water and food. These acts stood in stark contrast to the tales of savage man-eaters. The reality of the A's was far more nuanced than any European myth. As skilled mariners, they had transformed Florida's treacherous coastline into a thriving maritime network. Generations of experience navigating tides, currents, and reefs allowed them to traverse waters that confounded European sailors. Their settlements were strategically positioned to maximize access to resources. While Dickinson glimpsed the surface of their world, archaeological evidence has revealed carefully organized communities with social hierarchies, governance structures, and a blend of practicality and spirituality. Shell mounds, once dismissed as simple refuse heaps, are now understood as ceremonial landmarks and territorial markers, reflecting the depth of the A's cultural life. Fishing weirs, traps, and tools crafted from local materials demonstrate a nuanced understanding of their environment, while decorative artifacts and burial traditions point to a society rich in culture and belief. The A's were not just surviving in this environment, they were thriving, crafting a sustainable and dynamic way of life that balanced innovation with tradition. The A's salvage operations were particularly striking. They didn't merely scavenge wrecks, They systematically extracted valuable goods with tools and techniques that showcased organization and ingenuity. Dickinson noted, "These Indians found many things in shipwrecks, and they did trade for pieces of eight." This glimpse into their salvage economy hints at the extensive trade networks that connected Florida's coast with inland territories, demonstrating a high level of economic and logistical sophistication. The A's also understood the power of perception. They had learned over generations of contact with Europeans that their reputation could be their greatest defense. After all, how do you deter invaders armed with muskets and diseases? You cultivate fear. The reputation for cannibalism, whether intentionally spread by the A's or imposed upon them by Europeans, worked as a psychological barrier. It was far easier to avoid a people believed to eat their enemies than to risk confrontation. The A's, like many indigenous groups across America, may have allowed these stories to flourish as a form of passive resistance, using European fears against them. Yet, beyond mere survival, the A's had a deep understanding of psychological warfare. Their interactions with shipwreck survivors like Dickinson suggest a calculated approach, balancing intimidation with selective mercy. While some Europeans reported encounters filled with terror, others, like Dickinson, recorded moments of leniency. This inconsistency suggests the A's were not indiscriminately hostile. Rather, they understood the power of uncertainty. Dickinson's own journal records a telling moment. The A's immediately asked him and his group whether they were English or Spanish. This was not an idle question. The A's had been dealing with shipwrecked Europeans for generations, and they knew the difference between allies and enemies. The Spanish had long tried to exert influence over Florida, while the English were viewed with even greater suspicion. Dickinson recounted, "They spoke words to us, but we understood them not. However, they seemed to examine us with great curiosity. One among them said, 'Are you Spaniard?' which much surprised us." At first, Dickinson's group tried to claim they were Spanish, fearing the consequences of admitting they were English. The A's, however, were skeptical. They inspected the goods salvaged from the wreck and, recognizing them as English, expressed doubt about the claim. The A's chief announced his intention to send one of the castaways to St. Augustine, the Spanish stronghold, to verify their story. The moment underscores the A's political awareness and strategic caution. They were not simply reacting with blind hostility or hospitality. They were making informed decisions based on their past experiences with Europeans. While in the custody of the A's, Dickinson and his party experienced a blend of intimidation, negotiation, and reluctant protection. He described how they were led inland, their fate uncertain. The A's warriors carried clubs and moved with a deliberate, calculated air. Whether as a show of strength or genuine threat, Dickinson couldn't say. Once inside an A's settlement, Dickinson's group was stripped of their belongings, a common practice with shipwreck survivors. His journal describes how the A's inspected them carefully, taking valuables and distributing their clothing among themselves. However, this was not simply random looting. Certain items were passed up the social hierarchy, showing an organized system of redistribution. Dickinson's fear never fully abated, but his observations began to shift. He noted that the A's, despite their reputation, did not immediately resort to violence. Instead, they seemed to be deliberating what to do with their new captives. Many of them had knives, which they had gotten out of wrecks, and they would draw them out and whet them upon their arms, looking at us as if they would cut our throats. Yet, despite this unsettling display, they were not killed. Over the next few days, the A's gave them food, mostly fish, though it was barely enough to survive. They interacted with A's women and children, who appeared more cautious than hostile. One of the most remarkable moments in Dickinson's account is when he describes a conversation between the A's and their neighbors. He noted that the different indigenous groups were not entirely aligned, and some spoke against the decision to keep the castaways alive. Some A's debated whether they should kill the foreigners, while others advocated for letting them go. They spoke much among themselves, and we knew not their meaning, but sometimes they would look on us and laugh, and sometimes show anger. This moment reveals a political dimension to their captivity. The A's were not just mindlessly holding them prisoner, they were discussing their value, their risk, and their potential usefulness. Eventually, Dickinson and his group were released, a decision that likely came down to both diplomacy and pragmatism. Had the A's truly wanted them dead, they would not have survived. Instead, they were passed along from one indigenous group to another, each deciding in turn how to deal with them, until they eventually made their way to St. Augustine. Clearly, the real cannibalism wasn't happening in A's villages. It was happening in the colonial system itself, devouring entire cultures through disease, warfare, and displacement. The system's hunger wasn't for flesh, but for power and land, consuming the lives, traditions, and social fabric of societies like the A's with brutal efficiency. But the end of the A's wasn't a singular event. It wasn't a great battle, a final stand, or a dramatic slaughter that made its way into colonial records. Their erasure was slow, more insidious, a combination of forced dependency, shifting political landscapes, and the inevitable violence that followed. By the late 1600s, the A's still controlled much of Florida's Atlantic coast, their towns and villages thriving along the waterways they had mastered for centuries. But Spanish expansion and the growing presence of other European powers began unraveling their world in ways that weren't immediately visible. The Spanish had a long history of trying to subjugate the indigenous peoples of Florida through missionization, trade, and political alliances. But unlike many other tribes, the A's never fully submitted to mission life. They lived outside the Spanish system, their leaders refusing to relocate to mission villages where disease and forced labor often decimated populations. This independence, however, made them a target. Trade with European shipwreck survivors introduced new goods into their society: iron tools, knives, beads, cloth, but it also tied them to a dangerous economy of scavenging and piracy. The A's frequently raided Spanish shipwrecks, taking not just cargo, but sometimes captives as well. To the Spanish, this made them not just an obstacle, but an enemy. In 1704, a formal Spanish military expedition was launched against them, not to convert them, but to end them. Spanish forces, aided by their indigenous allies from missionized tribes, launched a campaign against the A's, burning villages, destroying canoes, and forcing survivors to flee inland. Those who didn't escape were taken to Cuba as slaves, their knowledge of Florida's coastlines making them a valuable asset in Spanish naval operations. We have seized the heathens and brought them to Havana, where they may serve under our Lord's rule, Spanish colonial records say from 1705. For the A's, who were captured and shipped to Havana, life did not improve. Most died from disease soon after arrival. The Spanish, already struggling to maintain their colonial settlements, saw little need for A's laborers when enslaved Africans and other indigenous groups could be forced into work instead. The A's faded from Cuban records within a generation, either assimilated, enslaved, or dead. Some may have escaped into the Florida interior, merging with the few remaining indigenous groups who still resisted Spanish control. There are unconfirmed reports from later Seminole accounts that speak of old coastal people who lived in isolated villages away from European settlements. Did some A's survive, hiding within the tangled wetlands of central Florida? Or were these fragmented remnants simply mistaken for other displaced peoples? Whatever the truth, the A's were gone from history, not because they were conquered in battle, but because they were slowly, deliberately erased. Their lands were taken, their people scattered, their name reduced to little more than a footnote in European records. And yet, even after their disappearance, the stories about the A's persisted, not as a people, but as monsters. The myth of the cannibal Indians outlived them, passed down in colonial writings and reinforced in sensationalized accounts of Florida's wilderness. It was easier to remember them as monsters than to acknowledge what had really happened. By the early 1800s, new waves of settlers arrived, completely ignorant of the people who had once ruled the coast. Their legacy was erased, their history rewritten, their existence reduced to fearsome legends told by those who had stolen their world. The A's had wielded fear as a weapon, but in the end it was their own legend that consumed them. As Jonathan Dickinson said, "And thus we were left to their mercy." A final brutal truth. Those who were feared as cannibals were the ones who showed mercy. And those who spread the fear, they were the ones who consumed everything. The myths of cannibalism surrounding the A's tell us more about the fears and ambitions of colonial powers than they do about the people themselves. The A's were not monsters. They were navigators, traders, and survivors who mastered a landscape others could barely comprehend. Their story is one of ingenuity and resilience, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The truth of Florida's past is often tangled in the myths written by outsiders. But the deeper you dig, the more incredible the real stories become. Stories of survival, adaptation, and brilliance that challenge everything we thought we knew. Want to dive deeper into Florida's untamed past? Follow us on Instagram at Mysteries of the Marsh for historical photos, newspaper clippings, and other artifacts from each episode. You'll get a behind-the-scenes look at the real people and places we discuss, plus updates on new episodes dropping every Saturday. Until next time, stay curious, and please, don't feed the gators.